Re-Zero, Arc 9, Chapter 58, The Sound of Chains.
Rigel. Natsuki Rigel, this howling furore of the soul, was being hearkened with certainty by Roy Alfard, earnest and frantic. It was an implore suffused with emotion as though smiting the chests of all listeners, such that, had it been gourmet, lay Batankatos, who loved the violent, impassioned emotions of harrowing cast of humans, and the wistful yearnings of desire oscillating in joys and sorrows, he would have lent his ears to that wish with delight and, whilst licking his lips, fulfilled that humble request without question. Roy, but, it wasn't Lay who's here, it's us, isn't it? Lay of gourmet and Roy of bizarre eating, twins who shared in the same witch factor of gluttony. To be precise, they were triplets with Louis, who had died inside their mother's womb, but contrary to expectations, they were siblings who had not been on the same wavelength with each other. Despite being siblings made of the same flesh and blood, what they regarded with importance as it pertained to meals was as though entirely different between them. However, they had never lamented the divergence in their eating habits. Rather, that they lived without having to scramble for the same prey between siblings was something to take delight in. Although Louis, unable to freely select prey of her own accord, with no choice but to pilfer food from the stomach of souls, seemed to find that vexing. Roy, can't be helped, can't be helped. Little sister is dear and cute even to us, you know. But, you see? Eating is something that is done for oneself, so an act so adroit as satisfying the stomach of someone else simply can't be done, you know. So, even if he took pity on his younger sister's implorations for her famishment, it was but the hunger of a close someone else. Even upon learning that Lay, ephemerally, had fallen in the tower of sand, that too was but the failed meal of a close someone else. Above all, he would neither think of it as something that deservingly served him right, nor would he lament and grieve that manner of finishing the meal. His thought was singular, the powerful emotion of it being wasteful. Roy, from Lay's viewpoint of gourmet, someone like us, constantly starving as we were, would probably be a disqualified failure hooligan or thereabouts, but we of bizarre eating would have gladly eaten Lay, who strangely noticing that he had been keeping Lay and Louis outside of the targets for his meals, Roy had the amusing, unbecoming thought that his familial love was surprisingly unabandoned. To think the bizarre eating who haphazardly and indiscriminately guzzled anything that caught his eye in entirety, had been, of all things, choosing his platters. Roy, did something truly regrettable, didn't we? It was unfortunate, but Lay had died. In addition, the presence of Louis, ever since the time spent in that tower of sand, could not be sensed within the stomach of souls, and it was unknown what became of her. It was truly, truly unfortunate. The next time he came into contact with his younger sister, he would surely chew her soul, and yet, Roy, after all, we are bizarre eating, you know. No matter how unsightly and repulsive a thing may be, once he thought of eating it, he could not help but stretch his tongue, even if gourmet did not so much as even turn to look towards it, even if it was atop a platter that satiation had pushed aside. He shall eat it, sparing naught. Above all, he could not bear to even think of giving up on an article he had once avariced in desire to eat. Outcrying from beyond the dust, was an Debran whose life had been cornered to a dead end. No, the predicament he was spiraling down into seemed to somehow be the result of having been placed into a situation that was the exact opposite of that. To thereupon recall Roy's existence, attempting to have his name eaten so that he could turn the board around, was an act that invited considerable pique and admiration, galvanizing the curse mark he had engraved to turn him into a yes-man and drag him along. Debran was frantically calling Roy. Inexplicable pain as though scorching the intangible soul assaulted Roy, his body quivering as it bounded upon the ground. An abuse of the soul, making the threat through agony to convey that, if he wished to elude this pain, he must obey. Roy, we get it, we do get it, we very much get it, we're saying we get it, as we get it, even though we get it, there's no choice but to get it, you know. Because we're saying we get it. Gluttonous drinking. Gluttony. He got what he wanted to say. He got what he wanted to make him do. He even got that he was cornered. In all honesty, even on the verge of his soul being scorched this way, Roy was grateful to Debran. Thanks to being taken out from the prison tower, he arrived at the opportunity of a meal that may have never reoccurred. The yes-man had few occasions for meals, but since Roy's merit was that he did not choose what he ate, that must have been convenient for Debran as well. Roy, but it'd be troublesome to have this misunderstanding, wouldn't it? Because he was grateful, he agreed to become a yes-man for him. But that only went so far as the extent Roy was willing to yield. Beyond that, Roy would do as he pleased. One such example being, Roy, Fu Ndu, as per his eating habits, an opponent whom he desired to eat even in exchange for his life, was one he would eat without fail. Rigel. Natsuki Rigel, as if spewing out blood, that scream resounded within the ears of the Witch of Tristicia as well. It happened right when she somehow managed to raise her body after being jostled about by a shockwave that seemed to level the ground, amidst a blast and vehement pressure that had surged forth from beyond the realm of her consciousness, inflicting severe damages upon the battlefield. Subaru, Petra. Are you all right? Shit, what happened all of a sudden? Is everyone safe? Even if her mind was dominated by the loud ringing in her ears, the voice of the imaginary Subaru as he worried over her was unconnected to her eardrums, so she could hear him clearly. What had reached her amidst that turmoil and anxiety of Subaru's as he worried for their fallen comrades, was Al's scream from the start. Witch of Tristicia. Within the dense haze of dust, the Witch of Tristicia coughed up the particles she had inhaled, receiving two distinct shocks from Al's scream, mixed in amongst the fierce winds. The first was how Al was planning to use the authority of gluttony to break this deadlock. And the other was the name that Al had shouted to be his true name, Natsuki Rigel. The sound of that name was clearly not unrelated to Natsuki Subaru. Petra, given that he's from another world like Subaru, I'd figured that Debran was a pseudonym, but the name that had emerged, Natsuki Rigel, was far too strange a coincidence. Rigel was the name of a star, and the family name Natsuki was the very same as Subaru's own. Surely, the requirements for being summoned to another world could not simply have been to bear the Natsuki surname in addition to a star name. Subaru, that guy's. Naturally, Subaru also knit his eyebrows with the same suspicions as the Witch of Tristicia. Al was full of enigmas, so although the Witch of Tristicia and her allies were confronting him and his resolve to make an enemy of the world, they did not have any idea about the true nature of his feelings or intentions. This, too, was just more proof of that. However, Witch of Tristicia, sorry. I've already made up my mind. The Witch of Tristicia was not enough of a child to prioritize focus on an unsolvable mystery here. What she needed to prioritize right here, right now, was not some new mystery that Al had raised to the surface, but a countermeasure against Al, who possessed a means to completely upend the game board even now that he had expended nearly all of the cards in his hand. If Al were allowed to carry out his course of action, that of having his own name eaten, there would no longer be anything she could do to stop him. Remembering what it had been like to forget Rem, the effectiveness of that had long since been proven. Witch of Tristicia, that's why I have to do this, Subaru. When the Witch of Tristicia murmured those words, Subaru stood not by her side, but directly in front of her. Not floating, but with both of his legs planted on the ground, he stood face to face with her. Subaru, staring true into his black eyes, the Witch of Tristicia felt a strangely deep emotion. The version of him present here, no matter how he strived, was nothing more than an illusion that showed her what she wanted to see, by no means the real Natsuki Subaru. From an outside perspective, it surely would have been an absurd delusion, merely a deception that was most convenient for the Witch of Tristicia. Witch of Tristicia, and yet, you still won't marry me, Subaru. Petra, I'm Witch of Tristicia, I'm kidding. It was just a witch's joke meant to tease you a bit. Poking her tongue out, the Witch of Tristicia apologized for troubling Subaru. The Witch of Tristicia proudly interpreted the fact that Subaru would not simply do as she said as a testament to her own noble feelings. For the person she loved to become exactly what she wished for would make her happy, yet it would leave her conflicted. Witch of Tristicia, after all, I fell in love with a Subaru who told me that I'm an idiot. Subaru, now that's a real honor. After all, I'm a goddamn idiot who's outrageously happy. Witch of Tristicia, that couldn't be more true. As Subaru responded to her confession in such a manner, the Witch of Tristicia pursed her lips. Then, the Witch of Tristicia spun around, turning her back toward Subaru, and then, after a moment of perhaps either rumination or hesitation, Subaru embraced the Witch of Tristicia from behind. This was a perfect score for her hopes and desires. Moreover, since the real, non-illusion Subaru would have done the same for her, it did not influence the Witch of Tristicia's final grade, and so, embraced by those arms, Roy, Fu Ndu, so too did a tenacious voice resound in close proximity, the threat drawing closer from the other side of the plumes of smoke. The Witch of Tristicia's fingertip pointed skyward, the corona fired from it being his signal. Rushing to make haste to her was the Sin Archbishop of Gluttony, Roy Alfard. Fangs bared, Roy crossed gazes with the Witch of Tristicia, and, Witch of Tristicia, it's Petra Baumann. Her finger thrust up toward the heavens, the Witch of Tristicia gave her name. The shuffle of names carried out amongst the Alderbusters as a countermeasure against gluttony with the cooperation of the Lord, Roswell. It was the result of the name-changing ceremony that had been accepted as something with official validity. As each of them selected a name as they pleased, the Witch of Tristicia received the surname of the person she loved and respected the most, but, revealing the newly changed name she had kept hidden until now could have been for nothing else. Nothing other than the ace up her sleeve, Subaru, Petra, with intangible arms, yet still tightening his embrace, Subaru called out her name. Hearing that voice, and placing her hands over his arms, intangible though they were, the Witch of Tristicia smiled. Smiling, the young girl who had offered up everything as compensation, and had become the Witch of Tristicia, spoke. Witch of Tristicia, Subaru, I love you, placing it atop his tongue, invoking eclipsing, a titillating numbness that perfused on the moment of eating rushed through his entire body. Roy, this precise climax of eclipsing was the true flavorful pleasure of gluttony, for which no substitute came to mind, even for Roy, who had eaten multitudes of names and memories until now and covetingly indulged in lives. Starvation of a hunger far too inordinate was the raison d'etre of gluttony. In a moment wherein he could hallucinate even a fragment of its fulfillment, he could feel raw, fresh sufficiency. That was certainly, Roy, the finest. The flavor of the witch who had kept her word intoxicated Roy with maximal love as he licked his lips at the aftertaste. Taken captive by emotions that surpassed his anticipations, severity that surpassed apprehensions, and purity that surpassed aspirations, Roy surfeited what a true eclipsing was as a sense of fullness in his stomach permeated throughout his body. Certainly, he had been living for this singular flavor. Even should his soul be scorched as indemnity for violating the curse mark, he harbored no regrets for this eclipsing. Upon these memories pouring in, Louis's reason for craving became explicitly clear. However, unfortunately, unlike Louis, what Roy's taste buds found to be the utmost sweet were the young girl's prayers. The witch who loved a singular platter to this breadth, splendidly transcended the anticipations he had borne prior to tasting. Thus, the Sin Archbishop of Gluttony, Roy Alfard, smiled, whilst being scorched by the blue flare emblematic of the curse mark's violation. He smiled, Roy, thank you for the treat, and, in the juncture he would be scorched by the blue flare together with his soul. That will be as far as you go. A deep crimson blaze suddenly emanated upon the battlefield, and mercilessly flashed through the blue flare. If one was asked to come up with something synonymous with the Sword Saint, Reinhard van Astria, the divine protection of the Sword Saint would likely be the first thing they would say. However, if it was someone deeply aware of just how absurd Reinhard truly was, they would also know that one of the many factors behind his status as the strongest Sword Saint in history was the sheer number of divine protections he possessed. In the past, when Reinhard had done battle against one of history's strongest existences, the Sin Archbishop of Greed, Regulus Corneas, the one who had been present there fighting alongside him, Natsuki Subaru, had appraised the divine protection of the Phoenix to be particularly extraordinary amongst the arsenal of his many divine protections. The power of the divine protection of the Phoenix, allowing him to resurrect even if he died, regardless of the fact that he was already nearly impossible to kill on account of his overwhelming strength, was truly an unfair ability. But, if Natsuki Subaru were to learn just how extraordinary the divine protection of the Phoenix truly was, his previous astonished evaluation of it being a cheat ability would have been eclipsed further yet. Reinhard, Divine protection of the Phoenix. Strictly speaking, since it had already been used in the battle against the Sin Archbishop of Greed, this was the next divine protection of the Phoenix that he had received, but since the phenomenon they induced was the same, there was no point in making a distinction. The important thing was that through the activation of this divine protection, Reinhard van Astria, as its holder, would be resurrected from his lost life, and when that occurred, all of his injuries, fatal or not, would undergo a complete recovery. Hence, at this moment, all the wounds Reinhard had sustained during his battle against the shadow of the Witch of Envy, spanning 3 days and 3 nights as he fought to avert ruination of everything at World's Edge, were undone. That also included the wounds that Debran and the Divine Dragon had inflicted upon Reinhard's arms, rendering them unusable. It even blazed his exhaustion from continuously fighting with no sleep to naught. That alone would have been enough to prove the extraordinary power of the divine protection of the Phoenix, but the true value for which Reinhard had turned to this divine protection was still yet to come. Through some plot devised by Debran, the menace of the Witch of Envy had been revived in the modern day. The moment it had suddenly vanished as abruptly as when it had first appeared, Reinhard deemed it the end of the battle instantly. He decided to inflict a mortal wound upon himself. If this had simply been for the purpose of healing his wounds, Reinhard would not have gone out of his way to inflict self-harm, and likely would have waited for his injuries to naturally heal. In other words, what he sought from the divine protection of the Phoenix was not the healing of his wounds, but the other effect that the divine protection induced, that was, Reinhard. That moment, clad in flames of deep crimson, Reinhard was resurrected in the midst of a battlefield. That was the other extraordinary effect carried by the divine protection of the Phoenix, the flames of rebirth that allowed the deceased holder to resurrect at any location they desired. In his battle against Regulus Corneas, the power had raised him from the ashes right before Natsuki Subaru's eyes, but in the current moment, the place where Reinhard resurrected went without saying. It was by the side of one who ought to have been fighting against Debran, cleaning up after Reinhard's failure, his master, Reinhard. Appearing from the flames that billowed in the winds, Reinhard stepped out onto the battlefield, his instincts immediately branding it an unnatural space in the throes of cataclysm. Even Reinhard could not help but be surprised at the sight, but, Reinhard, turning around at the sudden call, Reinhard spotted his lovely friend who had an air of seriousness about them, and held in their arms was his master Felt. Perceiving it to be an urgent situation, Reinhard immediately hastened to his master. Held in his friend's, in Ferris's arms, Felt's head hung limp, bereft of strength. Nobody was more suited to that task than Ferris, but he would at least try to say something to Oi, Reinhard. Quicker than Reinhard could address her, that frail rasp of a voice was spun. Amidst the dust, Felt was enveloped by a faint glow cast by Ferris. Receiving the light of healing focused on her head, she slowly lifted her face, and while her vision blurred in and out of focus, those red eyes of hers captured her one and only night. Then, mustering all the strength left in her body, she put together a single sentence. That was, Felt, I leave the rest to you. Those words spoke to Reinhard, telling him that what he currently needed to do was not to worry about his master. Reinhard's master was strong. Far stronger than Reinhard could ever hope to be. Therefore, Reinhard, that will be as far as you go, in trusting his master, who had fulfilled her duty, to his friend, and spurred onward, Reinhard advanced onto the battlefield. In that instant, he pinpointed all the presences that dotted the region, headed towards the enemy among them who needed to be dealt with, and in a solitary flash, reduced Roy Alfard of gluttony, engulfed in blue flare, to nihil, erasing him from the world of the living. Roy, thank you for the treat. That which was scorching the smiling Roy Alfard, was a blue flare set ablaze upon the firewood of his soul, never to dissipate. Thus, Reinhard assisted his suicide as to not allow him to suffer for long. And then, Reinhard, Aldono, this time, I shall stop you for certain. Kicking off the ground, Reinhard soared toward Debran, standing amidst the dust storm. Even without needing to borrow the power of compression, it was a movement of such speed that it appeared to have crushed space. Between Reinhard and Debran, a girl promptly stretched out her arms. The red-haired girl had moved as fast as possible in an attempt to protect Debran. Brushing her aside, Reinhard delivered a karate chop to her neck without permitting any reaction, reaping her consciousness to the beyond in the blink of an eye. Then, toward the defenseless Aldebaran, Reinhard once again pulled his arm back. Reinhard, this is my duty. Instantly, an unrelenting blow from the sword saint struck Aldebaran's torso, far in the distance. An azure inferno dispersed beyond the dust, and in the very next moment after beholding that, he watched as the slender back of Ye crumbled before his eyes. He had been about to reach his hand towards her as she abruptly fell, but which parts of his mind had been at work to cause that? Either way, Aldebaran's hand had failed to reach her. Same as it ever was. Then, without so much as a moment to blink, a white flash scythed across Aldebaran's torso. Aldebaran, oh, too. Without a doubt, as the strike of the hand flashed across his waist, Aldebaran was cleaved right in two. But regeneration commenced the very moment he was split apart, and Aldebaran's flesh was restored with a vigor as if a video played back in reverse, instantly mending the halves of his bisected body. That was the transcendent potency of the healing magic cast upon Aldebaran by the blue, and the magic trick of severing the human body accomplished by the sword saint's hand slash, far sharper than any run-of-the-mill treasured sword. But Aldebaran can't die. An affirmation, or a refutation, just how had that appeal resonated? A blow from Reinhard, yes, from Reinhard. He, who ought to have been neutralized by the summoning of the Witch of Envy, had appeared, and although Aldebaran had basked in his unrelenting karate chop, he did not die. Given that he had bisected his torso, Reinhard had surely launched that attack with the goal of slaying Aldebaran. But the healing arts of the blue surpassed even the murderous intent of the sword saint, impeding the activation of his authority. Aldebaran, for a moment, ignoring the pain that he was not sure even existed or not, Aldebaran pondered. Reinhard was present. Problem. Trouble. All his calculations were set back to square one. Moreover, if the reason for his presence was not simply because he had forsaken the world, it meant that the Witch of Envy must have withdrawn, and if the Witch of Envy had withdrawn, it would have been because that which she had needed to silence had been lost. In other words, it was proof that Roy had broken the oath of his curse mark, and had used his authority on the Witch of Tristicia. And he had done so fully aware that he would pay that penalty with his life, as an act of retribution for having been forced into submission. Had the Sin Archbishop thrown away even his own life? Only one thing was certain: any chance of Aldebaran breaking through this situation with his own efforts had been severed. Aldebaran, HK, the possibility of gluttony had slipped through his fingers. Recognizing that fact, Aldebaran sparked his thoughts as he grit his teeth, resolving himself to use every last one of his actions from this point forth to break through this deadlock. Every breath, every pulse, every drop of sweat from his fingers, to none would he permit any futility. With that firm warning to his own soul, Aldebaran embraced the falling Ye. He embraced Ye? Aldebaran? This was right after Aldebaran had decided on what he must do. Fully utilizing every fraction of every instant from that moment forth, he would overcome this accident. That was what he had resolved in his heart. And yet, why had he reached towards Ye, and embraced her? She had lost consciousness, and the odds that she was just masterfully playing dead were zero. Even if he were to hold Ye up, he would not be able to break through the situation. And yet, for what reason, had Aldebaran? Reinhard, you know it deep down, too. This will be as far as you go. As Aldebaran stood dumbfounded, failing to understand the meaning of even his own actions, Reinhard's voice, unimaginably healthy for one who had been engaged in a death ballet against the Witch of Envy, struck his ears. Reinhard was simply telling him to give up. This would be as far as he went. He was telling him, Aldebaran, well, you're also surely carrying a lot upon your back, Sword Saint, but it's not as if I started this with a resolve so cheap that I'd relinquish it at the drop of a hat. Reinhard, Aldebaran, it's not over, not yet. This is nothing. Don't you go thinking that I'd give up so easily. Putting up a brave front, Aldebaran glared at Reinhard. By surpassing his opponent in sheer intensity, he wished for at least one thing that his fingers could grasp onto. But, in response to Aldebaran's vigor, Reinhard raised the hand he had used to slash him aloft, and responded. the karate chop that the Sword Saint had performed to split Aldebaran in twain, that very hand was clutching something that could not have possibly been there, a black orb woven by magic. Reinhard, even with this, left speechless as he stared motionlessly with eyes wide open. Aldebaran realized that the Sword Saint's flash from earlier had not aimed for his life, but specifically for the bisection of his torso. With that as his target, Reinhard had done it. Believing in the power of the blue, he quite literally split his stomach open, and, splitting Aldebaran's stomach, he had retrieved it, that which ought to have been discarded at the Grand Mogulade Giza, into the hole which led beyond this world. Aldebaran, but even so, it can't be broken, the shock had not worn off. Even so, he still possessed the initiative, devised by the witch. It was a forbidden art that reliably sealed any who had been granted power by a witch factor. Even with Reinhard's absurd levels of power, even with the world-rending breath of a dragon, it could not be broken. Thus, no matter what happened, Aldebaran would not lift that seal. Reinhard, no, it's Subaru who's sealed in here, isn't it? In that case, it can be drawn. Instantly, a torrent of power surpassing all normalcy quaked the atmosphere, and a shudder certainly ran through the world. That was simply how tremendously significant the drawing of this sword was, to the point that even the world was unable to ignore it. That was, Reinhard, Dragon Sword, read. With that flash of impossible radiance, the small magic orb in the Sword Saint's hand was rent asunder. There is nobody who can defeat you, you whom I created. Those were the words of the witch, who had taught Aldebaran everything that he knew, and had bestowed upon him the name of the following star. Look at that, it is mine victory again. Those were the words of the Sun Princess, who had given meaning to Aldebaran's life outside of being a following star. Aldebaran, the foolish, powerless Aldebaran had lost both of them, so despite being one who possessed an authority that was supposed to rectify earned choices, ultimately, he had continued to choose the most half-hearted path. Only, he would not allow the birth of the witch who would end the world. Everything had been for that purpose. Receiving the witch's teachings, and acting in accordance with her wishes, he had attempted to kill the witch. He had failed, meeting Priscilla, and acting to make her the monarch, he had attempted to kill the witch. He had failed, falling back on his initial resolve, and acting to remove Natsuki Subaru, he had attempted to kill the witch. He had failed. Aldebaran, as a blinding light spilled forth, feeling his eyes being scorched even from behind his steel helmet, Aldebaran bore witness to the marvel of brute force taking place right before his eyes, and the result of that rule-defying power. The phenomenon brought about by one suprarational power was severed at the hands of another suprarational power, so when that which had been sealed was released, the only thing Aldebaran could do was to tighten his arm around the slender body in his embrace, as if having a tantrum, and then, HK, a faint respiration, one he by no means should have been able to hear, scratched at Aldebaran's consciousness. That was something which belonged to the silver-haired girl behind him, who had been wielding her strength to fend off the inundating flood, emitting a tremendously cold air to prevent the battlefield from being swallowed by the muddy stream. If that had been a lament for being unable to completely dam the rush of water, he could have endured it. If that had been a sigh of relief at Reinhard's arrival, he could have endured it. If that had been satisfaction for the abhorrent Aldebaran having been cornered, he could have endured it. But it was none of those things. That which her amethyst eyes had trained their gaze upon, was but a single person. After all, no matter the time, Aldebaran would never be reflected in those eyes of hers. Aldebaran, Natsuki Subaru Yuyu, he shouted. He screamed. He roared, with a hoarse voice that quite literally seemed to spew forth blood. Aldebaran cried out that name. Emerging from within that light, was a black-haired boy embracing a dress-clad great spirit. That unmistakable individual, with the vigor of having been liberated from the black orb, dropped one knee upon the ground. Then, as his lips opened, the very first thing to exit his mouth was a yell. Rem. As if in response to that call, the sound of chains grated upon Aldebaran's eardrums. Rem loved Natsuki Subaru. This was an unshakable truth, one that Rem, even before fully regaining her memories, would have had to admit with reluctance. Or rather, whether she had memories or not, it was an inevitability that Rem would be attracted to Subaru. So frankly, What exactly had she been holding back for? Rem, no, that isn't right. That would be taking things a little too far, or rather. First of all, that would make it sound like I'd fall for that person even if he never did anything for me, right? Rem believed that her own feelings were nothing so convenient. Rather, Rem viewed herself as a fastidious, distrusting woman who would not easily open her heart. Even if she said so herself, she shuddered at how unapproachable of a girl she must have been. She was vastly different to the honest and compassionate Ram, or the cute Katya, whose true feelings were painfully obvious despite her abrasive attitude. Indeed, the original Rem had been an unapproachable girl with a poor attitude and ugly personality. Her perspective had been narrow, her world small, too preoccupied with guarding her own self-imposed sanctuary to spare a thought for others. And yet, Natsuki Subaru had stepped inside, stepping in, trampling over it, taking her by the hand, and leading her out from there. Rem had fallen head over heels for him. Thus, those who had done so, and those who would go on to do so, would only continue to grow with time. Rem, still, among all of them, the fact that Rem was the very first one will never change. Rem had been the first one to recognize the greatness of Natsuki Subaru. Emilia may have been a worthy contender for that, but in terms of depth and weight, Rem would insist she was first. That, too, was something unshakable. Something precious, tied to Natsuki Subaru. Rem, the mansion, the royal capital, and Flugel's great tree, the path that Rem, who loved Natsuki Subaru, had walked alongside him before she had lost her memories. Rem, the jungle, the fortress city, the imperial capital, and the coupled dragon carriages, the path that Rem, who had begun to love Natsuki Subaru, had walked alongside him after she had lost her memories. Rem, the past, present, and future, the path that Rem, who had fallen in love with Natsuki Subaru again, would walk alongside him now that she had regained her memories. Even without needing to be told by Ye so many times, Rem understood that it was too simplistic to lump all of that under the single word of love. Nevertheless, if asked the name of that which impelled her, the driving force of the hope that declared that, no matter what happened, she would have no regrets, then she could think of naught else but love. Because of love, Rem was able to believe in Natsuki Subaru. Because of love, Rem was able to devote herself to Natsuki Subaru. Because of love, Rem was able to yearn for the same future as Natsuki Subaru. Rem ni-sama, there is one thing I want to ask you. That was a conversation Rem had before they went off to battle with a girl, who, just like herself, was in love with Natsuki Subaru. Rem understood that she, too, was one who had met Natsuki Subaru and deviated from her original self. She was one who had found happiness in that fact, and decided to walk alongside him on his thorny path. She was also one who knew of those eyes which were fixed straight ahead, looking at someone other than herself, the gaze of her beloved that she could not help but wish would turn toward her. Rem ni-sama, would you do anything to help Subaru? Afterward, Rem pondered over it. Just how much courage had it required to ask that question? Just how much deliberation did it take to convey the words she had prepared for that moment? And hypothetically, if Rem were to give an answer that failed to meet her expectations, just how much resolve, how many ideals, would she have to bear, as she walked that path alone? Rem, yes, of course. I am Subaru-kun's Rem, after all. That was why being able to respond to that without hesitation was something Rem was proud of beyond measure. In a way, it was a contest of whose feelings for Natsuki Subaru were stronger. And it was a hidden vow that she could never entrust to Emilia, the one he fell in love with. What would happen if that vow were to be fulfilled? The truth was, Rem had no clue. The only thing she knew was that it would help Natsuki Subaru know, to the contrary. That it would allow her to be the first among the many feelings Natsuki Subaru, that kind-hearted boy, would bear. To wish for more would be extravagant. Yet, now that her memories had returned, she had become greedy, and even knowing it was extravagant, she yearned just a smidgen for what lay beyond. For example, once that boy was pushed forward by Rem and the others onto the path he walked, then she wished that he would feel the devotion of Rem and that girl, not just as a mere ripple on the surface of his heart, but as much more, a great wave. That alone was Rem's. Rem, the moment his figure appeared beyond that white light, Rem's endearing sentiments shattered. In that moment, swept away by a torrent of unceasing emotions that surged from within, Rem felt an irresistible urge to cast everything aside and rush into his arms. She endured it. Immediately after, the earth beneath her feet exploded upwards, and the rising wall of rock threatened to engulf her entire field of view, only to be swept aside in a single flash by the Sword Saint, leaving the lingering afterglow of flames upon his form and clearing the path. Directly ahead, straight in front of her, Rem and the eyes of the boy she loved met. Rem, prepared to die, yet unable to be rid of the kindness at his core, the young boy's black eyes met her gaze. 1,000 words she longed to convey, 10,000 feelings he desired to express, 100 million prayers she wished to offer. Swallowing them all, Rem said, "Rem, once more, please make my current self. Please make Rem fall in love with you again." That instant, she swung her arm with all her might. The iron ball flew true, streaking straight through the sky, the sound of chains ringing out. In that instant, his own blood-curdling scream, the protrusions of the ground caused by the utmost extent of magic he had unleashed in a trance, the negation of that cataclysm by the supreme flash of the Sword Saint severing even the glaciated atmosphere, the fact that it seemed like the man who had appeared while hugging the spirit had been utilizing the authority of greed to keep a grasp over the situation, the fact that he was subconsciously tightening his embrace on the warmth of the woman in his arm, absolutely all of it, did not matter to Debran in the slightest. Merely, with reckless abandon, he reached out his hands. No, he only attempted to reach them out. He had failed to do so. His right arm was embracing the woman who had betrayed him, and his left arm had been abandoned all that time ago alongside the witch's expectations, so Debran had failed to reach out his hands. Instead, the man, having gathered the attention of all present there, trained his gaze upon him, and called out. The emotions dwelling in those black eyes, the fact that it seemed like he wished to save even Debran if he could, that color of Natsuki Subaru was, above all else, more than anything, eclipsing aught in his heart. "Debran, I absolutely fucking hate you, you shitty oh." The sound of chains rang out. "I love you."